Hey everybody, Jay here, solo for a second. We just recorded an episode with a guest where we talked about the famous George Washington letter to the Truro Synagogue in Newport, Rhode Island. And at the end of the episode, Chailea and I were talking and realized that at no point did we actually read the letter. So we thought, just so everyone had the context of what we're talking about, which tends to be helpful, we decided that I would record a preface to the episode and read the letter to everybody. And I will also, to go along with that, I will share the letter as well. So for those of you on audio only, the letter goes like this. While I received with much satisfaction your address replete with expressions of esteem, I rejoice in the opportunity of assuring you that I shall always retain grateful remembrance of the cordial welcome I experienced on my visit to Newport from all classes of citizens. The reflection on the days of difficulty and danger, which are past, is rendered the more sweet from a consciousness that they are succeeded by days of uncommon prosperity and security. If we have wisdom to make the best use of these advantages, which we are now favored, we cannot fail, under the just administration of a good government, to become a great and happy people. The citizens of the United States of America have a right to applaud themselves for having given to mankind examples of an enlarged and liberal policy, a policy worthy of imitation. All possesses alike liberty of conscience and immunities of citizenship. It is now no more that toleration is spoken of as if it were the indulgence of one class of people that another enjoyed the exercise of their inherent natural rights. For happily, the government of the United States, which gives to bigotry no sanction, to persecution no assistance, requires only that they who live under its protection should demean themselves as good citizens in giving it on all occasions their effectual support. It would be inconsistent with the frankness of my character not to avow that I am pleased with your favorable opinion of my administration and fervent wishes for my felicity. May the children of the stock of Abraham, who dwell in this land, continue to merit and enjoy the goodwill of the other inhabitants, while everyone shall sit safely under his own vine and fig tree, and there shall be none to make him afraid. May the Father of all mercies scatter light and not darkness upon our paths, and make us all in our several vocations useful here, and in his own due time and way, everlastingly happy. George Washington. We're back.
Hi. Good morning.
Yeah. It's afternoon here.
I know, so but this is a Pacific Standard Time podcast.
And I see.
Yeah,
I see.
And we go according to the Pacific time.
Well,
the superior time.
The fact I'm awake here is we're recording at a time before my bedtime is
that's true.
Revolutionary.
But you go to bed at 4 p.m., so it's hard
true.
It's hard to get you.
Actually, on PST, that's not too far from the truth. Actually,
no, I know. If I text you after 4 p.m., I know we're not getting a response till the next day. Which no judging. I'm just saying it's a bit weird for someone your age, but I'm living my best life. Yeah, exactly. But you might notice that we're missing someone today, which, he would have had a lot to say already. But we're doing an interview. So my dad is not here. So we have a break from him. If anybody listens to this podcast just for me and Jay, this is your lucky day because he's not here. So.
Yeah. So today we've got Sarah Skwire on the podcast today, who is a senior program officer at Liberty Fund, which is an educational foundation in Indiana. But the reason that we have her on specifically is what's your name? Chailea and I have been wanting to do an episode for a while on the famous George Washington letter to the Hebrew congregation in Newport, Rhode Island. And in doing research on that, we found that Sarah has written quite a bit on this topic, and we thought it would be a great discussion to bring her on and talk a little bit about this and some of her other various interests, which are manifest. So, welcome to the show, Sarah.
Thank you. Thanks so much for having me.
Yes. We like bringing
absolutely.
people on who are really smart and like good writers, because then it like elevates the conversation in a way that
I will do my best.
Yeah, exactly. Don't worry. You don't have to try that hard. You will definitely elevate us.
I mean, I know we're bringing you on to talk about the George Washington letter, but in doing background about you, you are truly a Renaissance woman. It's I mean, you're a poet. You've written about Shakespeare and Adam Smith and Oliver Cromwell and
Buffy the Vampire Slayer.
Oh,
and I mean, how could I be remiss if I didn't include that?
Oh my God, I love vampire shows. Do you only like Buffy or other vampire shows too? I'm just sorry, Jay.
I like a lot of them. I'm not a Twilight fan.
Oh, okay. What about Vampire Diaries?
I haven't seen it.
Oh, okay.
I was probably having children when Vampire Diaries was coming out.
Yeah.
And thus missed it all.
True Blood?
Yeah, True Blood is great.
Blood. Yeah, it's great.
My wife was obsessed with True Blood.
Yeah, it's a great show.
As I think most women of a certain age were.
Yeah.
But so the letter, so I probably shouldn't assume that people know what the letter that George Washington wrote to the Truro Synagogue is. So I guess, Sarah, do you want to just sort of give a quick primer for everybody on what that letter was and its impact on sort of how on religious toleration in America?
Absolutely. So the letter that we're talking about dates from August of 1790, which is a little over a year after Washington is inaugurated, about a year and a half plus since the Constitution is signed and put into law. So we're really at the very kind of earliest days of a political version of America that kind of has all of the pieces in place, right? We're post-revolution. We're immediately post-constitution. We're immediately post the first presidential inauguration. And Washington comes to visit Newport. And when he's in Newport, he's addressed by, he's sort of given a welcome speech by Moses Seixas, who's one of the officials of the Newport congregation. And that's a fairly big deal in and of itself, right? The Jewish community in Newport was prominent in shipping and in trade, and a lot of sort of mercantile efforts in Newport. But to have a Jewish man address the first president of the United States is a pretty big deal in and of itself. And so Seixas gives a speech to welcome George Washington. And when Washington returns from his Newport trip, he writes a letter back to the Hebrew congregation to thank them for their words and for their support. And so that's the letter that we're talking about.
Mm-hmm. So at the time in the 1790s, mm-hmm. One of the interesting things that I find about the Jewish communities, and there weren't really rabbis at the time, right? The communities were very much lay-led. The communities were obviously very small. I mean, was Newport one of the bigger Jewish communities?
It would have been, I don't have numbers on this, but right. It would have been probably one of the larger ones and certainly one of the longest standing ones. The history of Rhode Island, as I'm sure Jay knows because that's where you are, the history of Rhode Island is one of, I want to say almost aggressive religious toleration. Mm-hmm. It is an absolute outlier in the early settling of the colonies. All of the people who get booted out of various New England Puritan colonies for religious misbehavior or disagreements come to Rhode Island. Anne Hutchinson, who I think everybody probably still has to read about at some point in high school, I hope. Roger Rhodes, I mean, just every sort of like unorthodox religious figure ends up in Rhode Island. And because of that commitment, that very serious commitment to religious toleration in Rhode Island. Jews are settling there very, very early. And I'm not sure that it's possible to really make clear to a 21st century individual how radical Rhode Island's stance on toleration is. I'm sorry, is my answer too long?
No, this is great.
Yeah.
So I'm not sure. Rhode Island in 1663 is established by a charter from King Charles I, right? And I happen to, of course, have that up in this other screen. I'm not quoting from the top of my head. And the founding charter of Rhode Island, it says it's meant to be a lively experiment that a most flourishing civil state may stand and best be maintained with a full liberty in religious concernments. Our royal will and pleasure is that no person within the colony at any time hereafter shall be in any wise molested, punished, disquieted, or called in question for any differences in opinion in matters of religion.
Wow.
Everybody, right? That's
right.
Huge. Yeah. This is written in a time when literally millions of people have been killed in 120, 130 years of religious warfare in Europe.
Right.
So
just
why
unending?
Right.
What was his motivation to give that leeway to Roger Williams and Rhode Island?
That's a good question. Charles II, of course, loses his father to political and religious unrest, right? 1649, King Charles I is tried and executed for treason against the king, which is really tricky when you are the king, but they managed to do it. England, even prior to that, has been bouncing back and forth between Catholics and Protestants and different versions of Protestants.
But that was the Glorious Revolution, right?
That's 1649 is the English Civil War. The Glorious Revolution is 1688.
Okay. All right.
That's okay.
Okay.
That's what I'm here for.
Thank you. Yeah. I appreciate that.
That's why I asked you.
I'm feeling the test so far. It's not a good start.
So there's been all of this unrest and this uproar, and Charles II had, as a young child, the experience of seeing his family destroyed and his father killed because of political and religious differences. And in the 17th century, political and religious, it's the same category. You can't unscramble the egg.
Right.
Their separation of church and state isn't.
Yeah,
it's not a concept.
Right.
Until maybe this Rhode Island charter. Right? When Charles II says basically religious questions will be a matter of individual conscience as long as you're not disrupting the colony. Right? Mm-hmm. Don't be a jerk. And you can worship how you please, if you please.
Right.
Mm-hmm. And for 1663, it's unbelievably radical.
Right. And to think about what Jews were living with in Europe, even up at, in the 1700s, in the late 1700s, in the early 1800s, I mean, Jews were not free. They were not emancipated across Europe. And so this idea that there was a new world that was going to be an opportunity for Jews to have freedom is really astonishing. I mean, I don't know. I went to a very religious day school growing up. And so we were always taught this idea that God, I don't want to bring religion into it, but God always sends the cure before the plague, right? We just have to find the cure. And so America was always considered in the religious world like a cure, because in the same year of 1492 that the Jews were expelled from Spain, was the same year that Columbus, came and discovered the New World. And so that was always used as an example in religious circles that like God sent a place that would be safe and free for Jews, even though things were terrible, on the continent. And so I don't know, I always had that kind of imagery in my head of like this new free world that Jews were going to be able to live and be, happy and equal. But it wasn't exactly like that. I mean, I think it took time. I'm curious if you want to talk a little bit about generally how Jews were dealt with here. Did George Washington know any Jews? I mean, like before.
I don't. I mean, he would have met presumably Seixas and maybe some other members of the Newport congregation. I don't actually know that. That's probably a really good question for your dad.
No, he won't know.
I don't know.
Chaim Solomon. There was a guy, I remember, Chaim Solomon was like one of the people who kind of helped fund the Revolutionary War. So maybe he had an interaction with him. Maybe, I don't know. But I don't think he was definitely he wasn't hanging out at people's Hanukkah parties and like. No,
that's not the vibe. Certainly. Exactly. I mean, he was one, he was awfully busy, and two, right. I mean, he was sort of busy. Yeah. But two, they're just, there's, it's not like, it's not like New York now when everybody's going to a bar or bat mitzvah every other weekend, right? Right. It's like, it's not like that then.
Right. There weren't that many Jews around. Yeah.
Right. Which actually, I think, makes the message of toleration in Washington's letter, when you think about it, all the more impressive. Yeah. Right. Yeah. It's fairly easy to see how, if you have a bunch of friends who are of a different religious faith than you are, how you might come to say, okay, this is not my faith tradition, but we need an active tolerance and appreciation for and respect for this other tradition. And I've seen it, and I've spoken with these people, and I've eaten the latkes, and I've had the pastrami, and
they're great.
The shakshuka, right? So, they're bringing, there are good things here, and these are people who are different, but their humanity is the same, and we should respect that. And that's fairly easy to do if you're hanging out together and you're eating together and you're bumping into each other on the subway and and your kids are going to school together and so on. But I think it's much harder to do when you maybe don't know any or hardly any Jews or Muslims or people of whatever the faith is, right? Because there's no face to put on it. There's no human face to put on it, right?
And I think it's interesting too that Haile brings up the 1492 example, because if I understand correctly, most of the Jews who are in Newport were from Spain and Portugal.
Yes, right. It's interesting because we tend to I'm going to get myself in trouble here. We tend to largely think of American diaspora Jewry as being Ashkenazim who came over in the 1890s, which is when my great-grandparents came over. And it's probably when you guys are younger than I am. Great-great-grandparents came over, right? And they come from Russia and Poland and Ukraine and so on. And we tend to think of, I think for a lot of American Jews, we tend to think of that kind of turn of the century wave of Jews coming in from Eastern Europe as the story of Jews in America. But it goes back so much farther, and the further back you go, the more Sephardim you find. And that is in part because of where things were dangerous at which time. It's in part because of who was trading and traveling at which particular times and what they were trading and traveling in. But I think we do our American Jewish history a disservice when we don't give a lot of credit to the importance of the Sephardim and the earliest Sephardic settlers
Absolutely. All of the first shuls in America were Sephardi and Orthodox, not in the way that we think of Orthodox today, but definitely traditional. There wasn't really Reform synagogues in the 1700s, right? Or
the Reform movement didn't exist.
Exactly. Exactly. That's what I'm saying. It was all traditional kind of Sephardi style until the immigrants from Germany and then later Eastern Europe came and things changed here.
Right. And so for your visitors, for your listeners, if you visit the Truro congregation, if you visit the shul there, it is a very traditional Sephardi congregation. It's more or less in the round. The bima is not, up front
up against the wall.
It's in the center, right? There's a women's balcony around the top, right? So it's very, very traditional Sephardi. And, if your main experience of American Judaism is, an Eastern European kind of a Ashkenaz thing, it's really cool and really different and interesting. It's a beautiful shul.
I'll make sure in the when we put this out on our Substack, I'll make sure to link to the Truro website because it's a gorgeous shul. It really is.
It is, and it's well worth a visit. They've got great sort of historic material on.
Yeah, absolutely.
All kinds of stuff.
So it's always interesting to me how certain historical documents how many letters did George Washington write in his lifetime?
Yeah.
Probably tens of thousands.
A lot,
of letters, hundreds of thousands of letters. So for this letter in particular, and now this is considered to be, one of the most important documents in the history of religious tolerance. How did it become known? Was it known at the time when he wrote this letter? How was it received? When did it become, I don't know, when did it sort of become in the canon of civil rights in America? All those sorts of questions about the history of the letter itself.
That's a good question. And I don't actually sort of work on Washington's publication history. I knew the letter to the Newport congregation. I knew because of my own personal historical interest in Jewish history, and just sort of an affection for writing about tolerance and toleration in the early modern period that kind of moves forward into this 18th century material. It is my assumption, however, that the letter would have been published probably in Newport's newspaper. We're dealing with a time period in which print culture is taking off like crazy in America. You could argue that the revolution would not have happened or succeeded without the pamphleteers and the newspaper writers in the colonies. So print culture is just roaring. So it would have been picked up certainly by a Newport paper or papers. And it may have been shared in, the Philadelphia press as well as sort of something of a public announcement. And I'm sure, shuls being shuls, right?
Yeah.
They never change, right? The shul would have publicized it as well. We got a letter from the president.
That's right.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
Pay your dues. Pay your dues. Letter from the president.
For sure. They probably still use that as their gimmick to get members, I'm sure. 200 years.
If you go to the website, it's prominently displayed. It's prominently displayed on the website. So
exactly.
Yes, you're right.
That's so funny.
So we should talk about the content of the letter, right?
Yes,
because
absolutely.
It's beautiful writing. It's a beautiful letter. And Washington does a couple of things in the text of the letter that I think are beautiful, and I think they're extraordinary, and I think that they're worth noting.
Great.
Especially for the listeners of your podcast. So Satius addresses Washington, and he says to him, look, what the history of the Jewish people has been like. It's been a dumpster fire. That's not the word I was going to use, but your dad is in the back of my head, Haile. So the word I was originally going to use did not come out. We'll go with dumpster fire. The history of the Jewish people has been a dumpster fire when it comes to freedom and when it comes to religious toleration. And we are grateful to be able to look to this new American government, this brand new constitution, this brand new president. He calls it a government to which bigotry gives no sanction, to persecution no assistance. Right?
It's beautiful.
When Washington writes back, he says, happily, the government of the United States, which gives to bigotry no sanction, to persecution no assistance. So he repeats Seixas's words back to him. Right? And I think that is gorgeous.
Yeah.
And I think it is generous. Yeah. Right? And I think it is smart. It's like politically savvy, but I also think, Washington literally couldn't have said it better himself. Than Seixas did. And he wants to be sure that that is conveyed. And so that ringing phrase is repeated in Washington. The other thing that Washington does, I'm sure you guys have been to plenty of ecumenical stuff where ecumenical means we're going to pray in Jesus' name like all of us do, right? Washington avoids that very neatly and very carefully, right? And when he closes the letter, it's very much in terms of the Hebrew Bible and terms from the Hebrew Bible. May the children of the stock of Abraham who dwell in this land continue to merit, right? And there's a word that we hear a lot in our liturgy. Continue to merit and enjoy the goodwill of the other inhabitants, while everyone shall sit in safety under his own vine and fig tree, and there shall be none to make him afraid.
It's beautiful.
Right? He could have picked any verse from any part of the Bible, but he chose from the Hebrew Bible.
Yeah.
Right. And that's a deliberate and thoughtful choice. And it's a considerate choice. Right. And for me, that emphasizes that Washington meant it.
Right.
Right. He's not just, of course, he's politicking, right? Because politician's going to politician. Right. So of course he's politicking. Right. We know that. But I think he genuinely means it. Right. Yeah. And genuinely is expressing with a kind of care and a kind of consideration that this kind of toleration and the support from this kind of community and the support for this kind of community in early America is important for the vision that he has of America from the very beginning and for the vision that the founders have for America from the very beginning.
Yeah. I'll say two things really quick and then Jay will jump in. But first of all, I really appreciate you pronouncing Moses Seixas's name because it's spelled so hard and I never, I'm always like tripping over it and not sure exactly how to say it. So thank you for that. I
Googled.
Yeah, good. Okay, number one.
I was like, it can't be. So it's spelled for listeners, it's spelled Seixas.
Right.
And I thought it can't possibly be pronounced sexist. That can't. And if I pronounce it that way on the podcast, one, you guys are going to get letters, and two, it's going to be really confusing.
Yes, no, I appreciate that. And the other thing I wanted to say is what I love about Washington turning those words around and sending them back is he's really addressing what the Jewish people in that community are scared of, right? And he's not just making some pat statement about general toleration about everyone, which we get a lot of all the time. This was like a very specific thing that he was addressing because he's using those same words that the community used to him. So I think that's really beautiful and something that politicians could learn from George Washington, along with many other things they could learn from him. But,
the thing I'm always blown away by letters like this is you think about in our life, like we write an email And we're like, let me just get through this. I just gotta bang out this email and just send it off. And it's you do kind of the bare minimum to get it out the door and say it's done.
Yeah.
But
now you can have an AI golem do it for you.
Exactly.
Well, even better, right?
Yeah.
But this was probably letter 200 of the day for George Washington or something like that. And the amount of care and detail and thoughtfulness he put into writing this letter is really it's really something to behold. And I think it's I'm sure as an English person, you probably appreciate the fact that in a large part language has been lost in our society, especially versus where it was at this point. And so that's really something that I've always been blown away about this letter, putting it in context of, the demands on George Washington at the time and the amount of attention he put into this specific letter is really,
that's such a good point.
Yeah.
It's a great point.
Yeah. It's beautifully written. And Washington's prose style in general and the prose style, I mean, he probably had Hamilton and other secretaries sort of drafting things and writing things for him, but that 18th century prose style is just gorgeous.
I know.
We haven't attained to those heights since.
I've read a few biographies on George Washington because he was always my favorite president. I always wanted to know more about him. I don't remember which book this was in, but I remember reading that he was such a commanding person, when you were with him in person, and everybody had so much respect for him that during the Constitution, what's it called? The Constitution Convention. I can't remember.
Constitutional Convention.
Yeah, the Constitutional Congress, whatever. Yeah. There was so much arguing. People were yelling at each other, and he would sit quietly and he would watch and listen. And the second that he would stand up or he would say something, everybody in the room got quiet and really turned to hear what he had to say or what he was thinking. And I just think about that kind of presence of a person. You earn that kind of respect. This wasn't a place, he wasn't the king. He didn't come from a family of kings. And I really admire that about him, that he really was able to command that kind of respect from very respectable people around him. So I don't know. I have a soft spot for George.
There's a lot to be said for Washington.
Yeah.
One of the most important things that he does is that after he serves his terms as president, he steps down.
Yeah. Exactly.
He says, "No, I've done my service to the country, and I'm going to go home.
Yeah,
and I'm gonna, it's someone else's turn, and we have a peaceful transfer of power.
Right. It's beautiful.
This is not the kind of things that kings do.
Right.
Right. This is sort of the first real kind of acid test." For a new nation, right? What happens when it's time for the president to quietly leave office? What happens when you lose an election? And we get Washington sort of setting the first real example of that, and it's really important. So
it's fascinating.
Yeah. I mean, we can't, slaveholder, right? So
I know. It's, he wasn't perfect, but
he's not perfect. Yes. No one's perfect, right? No one in the time is perfect, right? This whole, Rhode Island is saying a lot of things about liberty and toleration, and there are probably enslaved people in the crowd who are listening to it, and that is that is an American truth that we need to grapple with. Consistently.
No, that's true.
Well, you look at the movie Amistad that takes place in Rhode Island.
Right. Oh, really? I didn't know that. Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah. It's based in Rhode Island. Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
Right.
I didn't know that.
But anytime, the hope is to always do better.
Right.
Right. And you have to start from somewhere if you're ever going to get better, right?
Yeah.
You can't sort of blow by the past and dismiss it all because it's not perfect. You have to say, what were they trying to improve?
Right.
In your research, writing this piece about this letter, was there anything that surprised you that you weren't expecting?
I actually didn't. I mean, there were a couple of things. The first big one, and again, this is mostly because my actual training is kind of Renaissance and Reformation English literature. So 1790s are ridiculously modern for me. I work like 120 years earlier most of the time, right? Shakespeare's my homeboy.
That's great.
So I did not realize when I first started looking at this letter and thinking about this letter, I didn't realize that it was a reply. Right. I thought it was sort of part of, Washington and sort of sending letters to various established congregations, Baptists and Catholic congregations and a Jewish congregation, and just sort of reassuring everyone that there won't be a national religion that is established and this and that and the other thing. So I thought it was part of sort of a large kind of a campaign like that. I didn't realize that it had come from a personal visit. Now, I'm sure that it was also a part of that kind of publicity work.
Right.
But to me, there's something, I'm just very touched by the fact that it's an answer. Right.
It's true.
Something about that communication. Right.
Yeah. And he essentially admits as much in the letter, because he writes, it would be inconsistent with the frankness of my character not to avow that I'm pleased with your favorable opinion of my administration and fervent wishes for my felicity. So he's admitting, he's like, obviously some of this is political. I want your votes.
Not gonna lie, thanks for the votes, right? I greatly appreciate it.
I love that. that. What a lost form. The letter, you made such a good point about just the writing and the letters. Like we have letters that my grandparents wrote to each other during a summer that they spent apart because my grandmother took her kids to Israel and my grandfather stayed in New York to work. And so we have all the letters, and it's so beautiful. I mean, and my grandparents were not literary, and they weren't the type of people who were lovey-dovey, but the letters express so much. I know so much more about them and their relationship with each other by reading those letters. I mean, when I die, my kids are going to have like text messages between me and my husband. Where are you? When are you going to be home? Can you pick up milk? I mean, literally, that's what they're going to have.
Did you see this meme?
It's so sad.
Here's a picture of a cat.
I'm sad about that. We've definitely, I feel like, lost that art of expressing ourselves through letters.
Yeah.
Maybe I'll start working on trying to do better.
All right. So I have a question. Since you brought up Shakespeare being your homeboy, I have to ask you. I have to ask you a question.
Yes.
Was Shakespeare anti-Semitic? So I have to say, as being a sophomore in high school, reading Merchant of Venice, and then getting to the end where they force Shylock to convert. I was like, ooh, this is,
I don't know.
This is a little weird.
Yeah.
It's a little awkward.
Okay. So I've taught like a whole, I've taught for the Tikva Fund, for their Tikva Online Academy and taught in their summer programs and stuff. And I've taught Merchant of Venice for Tikva. So to boil that class down a bunch. I'm going to not give you an answer, because why would I give you an answer? What I'm going to give you is several things to think about.
Okay.
The first of which is Jews had been expelled from England,
right?
In Shakespeare's time. He almost certainly never met a Jewish person,
right?
So his knowledge of what it means to be a Jew, or what Jews are like, would have come from popular culture,
right?
Which was filled with things like, for example, the accusations that Queen Elizabeth I's Jewish physician had tried to poison her. And filled with things like the play The Jew of Malta by Christopher Marlowe, which is only read by people who go to graduate school for Renaissance Reformation English literature. So you're excused on that one, Jay.
All right, thank you.
But which is useful if you really want to think about the question of whether Shakespeare is anti-Semitic. I think it helps to read Jew of Malta and do a comparison contrast to the Merchant of Venice. I certainly don't think the Merchant of Venice is philo-Semitic in any way, but the question about the play is whether the play believes, and we can't, like, for me, I want to talk about what the play thinks rather than what Shakespeare the man thinks, because like so many early moderns, we just, I mean, he didn't leave us a diary. He didn't leave us letters.
Right.
We can look at the plays and try to like back engineer what he might have thought. But for me, it's easier just to say, what does the play think?
Sure.
So for me, one of the questions is whether the play thinks that Shylock is a villain because he's a Jew, or whether Shylock is a villain and he is also a Jew.
Oh, interesting.
Right?
That's such a good way of looking at it.
So does Shylock does really, really bad stuff. Right. I mean, we can all agree that Shylock does not behave in any way like a Jew should behave.
Yeah.
Right? And in fact, Talmud expressly forbids Jews from enforcing the kind of contract and the kind of debt repayment that would cause undue suffering or death in the person who's being forced to repay you. So Shylock has created this this deal with Antonio that's going to kill Antonio if it's fulfilled, and Talmud says you can't do that, right? So we can say from our standpoint that Shylock is certainly not only a bad guy, he's also not a very good Jew.
Right.
In a lot of ways, right? He's violating Jewish law, right?
Right.
That's an enormous problem.
Yeah.
Right. Now, this is all true, and it can be true at the same time that a lot of Shakespeare's characters, particularly Portia in the trial scene, are repeating and instantiating a very old and familiar Renaissance kind of insistence that Jews are the people of the law and the law only. Christians are the people of mercy. Shylock's problem is that he doesn't show mercy. That comes out of the fact that he's Jewish and he's bound by the law. But I think it's an incredibly complicated and interesting question, actually. I don't know that we can get an answer to it that is as straightforward as the question can be put. But I think that there are complicated ways to attack the subject of Merchant of Venice and of anti-Semitism, and to think about it that actually sort of deepen our understanding of what it means to represent Jews in literature when you are not Jewish, when you are not familiar with Judaism, right? And also whether Shakespeare actually is making an effort, right? Because Shylock gets the speech, right?
Right.
He hath not a Jew eyes, hath not a Jew hands, right?
Right.
Mm-hmm.
He takes that beautiful speech about our common humanity and then says, and since I'm human just like you, shouldn't I be again, editing for your father's sake, Hyla? Should I not be, since I'm human, just like you, shouldn't I be a really horrible human just like you guys are? Right?
Right. Which is such a good point.
Wrong lesson, Shylock, right? But
fair. Yeah. Fair
right.
Point taken. Point
taken. And an interesting way to sort of think about what shared humanity means.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, I would offer a very non-educated feeling about Shakespeare. I do not have a graduate degree in literature, and I barely, compared to Jay, I'm like, I know nothing. And compared to you, he knows nothing. So this is a hierarchy of like
the second part of that is definitely true.
No, but Jay, you can't compare. But I've always use this principle of Jewish law that a baby or a young child are not responsible for mitzvot, for commandments, if they don't know better, right? So if a baby breaks Shabbos, obviously that's not like they don't get punished for it. And so I've always used that principle when thinking about Shakespeare Shakespeare and other people with regards to anti-Semitism, because if he didn't know Jews and he didn't really live amongst Jews, and he probably never met one, as we assume, I can't really blame him and say he's an anti-Semite. He didn't know, right? Like what you're saying is he's taking it from the culture, or he's taking it from what he's been told maybe in the church or by his parents or whatever. And so I don't know. I use that principle when it comes to anti-Semites around the world and throughout history, actually. If they didn't know Jews, like if you know the Jews and you hate them, well, it depends in what context, I guess. I
but it's a more complicated or a different kind of conversation.
Exactly. Right? So I don't know.
And part of me asked the question. It was a little bit tongue in cheek.
Yeah,
I think it's basically irrelevant. I mean, I think what Shakespeare brought to the world is far more important than what his feelings of Jews were.
Right.
It's just something I've heard batted around a little bit in different circles throughout my life. So I figured I'd ask.
So I think that's true, Jay. But I also think that we don't see ourselves represented so often in the really great big works of Western literature, certainly that early.
That's a good point.
We don't see ourselves there so often that we can ignore or not talk about those representations when we see them.
Yeah. That's a great
if look, there are plenty of school kids, right, whose first interaction, I mean, I grew up in Rocky River, Ohio, right? So let's be clear. There were plenty of people probably in my school whose interaction with Jews was limited to reading Merchant of Venice and knowing me.
Right.
Right. It's not a rich tapestry.
Yeah.
Right. So I think it is worth talking about those representations and talking about ways in which we can kind of deepen our understanding of what they mean. And if they, if it is an anti-Semitic, I'm not sure that's really the word, but if it's a representation that we don't like and that we don't want to see carried forward of the Jewish people, what can we say about it that will deepen it and make it more complicated and make it more interesting for ourselves and for our kids and for, those other like only Jewish kid in the high school, right, who's sitting there. Right. How do we? Right.
I hope they're reading. I hope they're reading these books. I mean, in high school,
Yeah, seriously.
I worry about that too.
We may have to have you back on. We can have a separate discussion about Jewish representation in Renaissance literature.
I know.
Anytime.
I have a question though. Before I don't know what Jay's going to ask you next, but quickly, what's your? So you have a PhD in literature, or is it more specific? Like, what did you write your thesis on?
Oh, see, now I'm a huge geek. I wrote on representations of illness in early modern literature.
Wow.
So I looked at, I know. I looked at, which is also fun because, it touches on all sorts of things, right? It touches on religion, touches on early science, it touches on politics, touches on sort of women's issues. And I looked not at sort of big epidemic illnesses like plague, but sort of, what did you do and what did it sort of mean to you? What was your cultural understanding of getting the sniffles or having a migraine, or how did you understand what that meant if you were a person living in the 1600s?
That is fascinating.
It was a lot of fun.
Yeah.
It is mind-blowing when you think about that. The idea of germs is relatively new. I mean, it's only been around for 150 years, if that, at this point. So so this idea of how did you get sick, like you said, with sniffles or with the plague, like how did you get those things?
And so, what was fun for me is that this period is really, in so many ways, the 1600s are kind of a tipping point for a lot of things. And it's right at this tipping point between sort of scientific in scare quotes, explanations of of illness and religious explanations of illness, or scientific explanations of events in general versus religious explanations of events. So if I can geek out just for 1 minute longer.
Go for it. Yes.
Please.
The famous diary writer Samuel Pepys, who's the sort of one of our great sources for knowing about the Great Fire of London and the plague and stuff. And he wrote down like everything that happened to him. Pepys goes to get a cup of coffee. We know about it. He would have been all over Twitter, all over Facebook. He's social media guy, right? So he gets a really bad cold and writes about it in his diary. And he says, I have this terrible head cold and I don't know if I got it because I was sitting in front of a cold window without my warm woolen waistcoat on, or if it's because the new rabbit's foot that I just got to carry in my pocket is cut off at a different point on the rabbit's leg. And so maybe it's not working as well. Right. And so there's this like, how are we explaining stuff? Right. What,
that's amazing.
And I love that.
Yeah.
Like, I love that weirdness and I am 100% here for it.
Do they mention COVID in any of the writings, or was that
no? No, but I will tell you when we were locked down for COVID, I wrote a whole bunch of stuff for Liberty Fund about sort of plague journals and accounts of the plague from Pepys and Daniel Defoe and others.
That's so cool.
And it is we should be humble too, because 150, 200 years from now, people are going to look back at things we believe today and say, man, they were idiots.
Yeah.
How did they believe that nonsense?
It's true.
I quite literally pray for the day when someone looks at me and says, wait a minute, you mean that cancer patients used to just have poison pumped into their veins and you kind of like hoped that it'd work?
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And sometimes it killed you and sometimes it worked. And,
it's interesting as a religious,
speedily in our time, right?
I know. I mean, it's interesting as a religious person kind of living at a time where we have so much more of an understanding of science and how our bodies work, and trying to marry, the religious faith with the science, and I think that's like a lot of what the religious world is dealing with now and trying to understand, because I think it was easier in a way if you're a religious person in the olden days, right? To think, okay, God is punishing me by giving me this illness, or, whatever. I spoke badly about someone yesterday and now I have a cold. Right. And so that's like kind of a simple way of living in the world. And now it's complicated, especially for religious people, because what does it mean, right? When you have natural disasters or physical ailments, or, is God speaking to us through each of these things? And what does it mean? And it's, I think, much more complicated in a way, because it's easy to just write things off as science, and to kind of understand where you play a role in it as an individual is harder,
Yeah,
absolutely. Yeah, for sure.
We should talk about Adam Smith. Jake.
Well, so that's what I was going to say. While I have you,
yes.
I am as well a very big fan of free market economics, and I noticed you've written quite a bit about Adam Smith. In particular, I read one article you wrote that I thought was great, and it was Adam Smith and his support of sauntering. And I love that article. But so could you just talk a little about your affinity for Adam Smith, and you've written quite a bit about him and his philosophy.
It would be my very great pleasure.
You should just know, before you start, you should just know that Jay and I met through a kind of libertarian leaning podcast. That's how we became friends. So
which podcast?
Well, I'm embarrassed. No, I'm just kidding.
The fifth column.
Kind of the Reason. Are you like familiar with Reason?
No. I read. I've published in Reason.
Yeah, so kind of through that world of the Reason magazine and publishing world. That's how we met. So this is something that we very much care about.
Great. Yes. No, happy to talk about all that. So a couple of. I must now make an announcement from my sponsor. So Liberty Fund has been publishing the complete works of Adam Smith, all of it, not just Theory of Moral Sentiments, not just The Wealth of Nations, but the essays on philosophical subjects and the letters on jurisprudence and the whole shebang. lectures on rhetoric and belles lettres. We started publishing those back in the 80s. Mm-hmm. So it has been a huge part of what Liberty Fund has done in terms of publications. We also have an entire website, adamsmithworks.org, that is dedicated to the life, the works, the times of Adam Smith. Another thing I did during COVID, when I was also writing about plague diaries, was that my friend Janet Buffton and I decided to read the entire Wealth of Nations and tweet our way through it in a project that we called Wealth of Tweets.
Oh my God, that's so cute.
That is archived at the adamsmithworks.org website. And spoiler alert, the 250th anniversary of the publication of Wealth of Nations is coming in 2026. 1776, you get the Declaration of Independence, you get Wealth of Nations, and you get the first volume of Gibbon's Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire. It was a heck of a year.
Wow.
It's a good year.
Right? I mean, English, like prose in English was like, you know. Anyway, so yeah, lots of things to say and think about Adam Smith. And it's been a large part of what I've done in the years that I've been working for Liberty Fund. Now I forgot what your question was, Jay.
Tell everyone who Adam Smith is first.
So
briefly,
Adam Smith, anyone else who you asked would tell you that Adam Smith is the father of modern economics. Right. And that is correct. But because of who I am, it behooves me to mention that Adam Smith began his academic career as a professor of rhetoric and lecturing on rhetoric and literature. And that is really important for those of us from English departments to know and to care about. He cares a lot about language. He also writes this big book on moral philosophy called The Theory of Moral Sentiments. And then he writes, after both of those things, he writes The Wealth of Nations, which is the sort of the founding book for modern economics. But he's one of these great 18th century, the world hadn't divided up into academic disciplines the way that it has now. So he kind of roamed widely through them.
Why is he still important? I mean, I know, but I want you to tell everyone.
He's still important because, did you see there's been like an argument on Facebook and Twitter recently about whether modern economists should read Marx and whether they're not appropriately historicizing their discipline if they don't read Marx. So you can do economics, you can do 21st century economic policy without reading Marx, without reading Smith, without reading sort of early economists. But if you care about the history of the discipline, right, and if you care about where these ideas came from, the answer in a lot of cases is going to be they came from Adam Smith, or at least they were first stated elegantly by Adam Smith. So the first chapter of The Wealth of Nations is, here's the division of labor and here's why it matters, right? And then everything sort of proceeds from there. So it's kind of your fundamental source for clear economic thinking about all sorts of basic principles that matter a lot in economics always, and always will.
Wow. It's fascinating.
It's interesting. Yeah. We've really run the gamut. I mean, when I said at the start of the episode that you are a Renaissance woman, it's true. It's true. We could talk about, I know you've read about Oliver Cromwell and I saw that you wrote a review of Mary Beard's new book about the Roman emperors.
So good.
Really?
Yeah, such a good book.
I'm excited to read that. So you've really run the gamut of kind of.
Do you have
everything?
Do you have a favorite book?
Do you have a favorite
Sarah's
child?
Favorite book? No, give us. Yeah, well, you have 2 kids. Give us 2 books. What are must read? Like, what do I have to read?
Those are such different questions.
I know. That's not.
You keep changing the question.
I know.
Let me tell you here. Instead, let me tell you 2 things that I'm reading right now.
Okay.
How's that? So I am rereading Hilary Mantel's incredible Wolf Hall trilogy. about Thomas Cromwell, who is Henry VIII's second in command. Absolutely spectacular. The first book, Wolf Hall, won the Booker Prize, and then there were 2 equally spectacular sequels. And there's a great, I think it's on Amazon Prime. There's a great video series of the books, the second season of which is coming out in March, which is why I'm rereading them.
Oh, cool.
So that's one of the things that I'm reading right now that I think would benefit everyone. It's so good on politics and on what it means to try and be a human being living in tumultuous political times. So I think that's one thing that I'm reading right now. And then what else am I reading right now? A lot of murder mysteries, but I'm also running, I run this once a month Shakespeare discussion group for Liberty Fund, where we read a play, and then once a month we get together and spend an hour and a half just kind of touching on some of the cool stuff.
Cool.
So our February group will be on Othello.
I was just going to say that's my single favorite Shakespeare play.
Well, you should come join us, Jay. I will.
Yes.
I'll email you both and give you the link. All you have to do is sign up for it. It doesn't cost anything. You just show up,
do that,
read, participate, hang out.
I will absolutely join you. I love Othello.
And the idea for that, actually,
how did I get stuck with these 2 losers?
But it's really it's really important because Haile, you need to know that the idea for that reading group came from I didn't finish it, but I did more than half of the current cycle of Daf Yomi.
Oh, you did?
Yes,
oh my God.
I sort of ran out of steam along the way. They got a little.
Oh, it's so. I know some of it's really.
There's
boring.
a lot.
I know.
If I was going to not do it with my whole heart, I thought I shouldn't do it. So I did a whole bunch of it. But what I loved about that was both the process of this enormously long, years long reading project.
Yeah.
Right. But also the way in which even a light touch on a complicated reading, you take something away from it and you can come back to it. Yeah. And you can come back to it and you can come back to it. Right. And I thought, let's do it with all of Shakespeare's plays, which will take a little bit over 3 years.
Wow.
Right. And we'll just do one a month and we'll just keep going. And we're not going to try and do a complete reading of every play. And we're not going to try, but we're going to just.
Well, let me know when you do Romeo and Juliet, because
We did Romeo and Juliet first out of the gate.
Oh, that's too bad.
Because I think it's one of the plays everybody reads first. But we should.
That's a good story. I love Romeo and Juliet.
It is a good story.
It's a beautiful story. But wow, that's for those who don't know what Daf Yomi is, by the way, I'll just quickly say that the Talmud is divided into I think it's a 7.5 year project of reading 1 page of the Talmud a day. And so it's like an international project. So everybody's on, usually you don't have to be.
I was doing it in English. I feel the need
that's okay.
to clarify.
No, that's fine. You could do it in any language, but it's a way to get through the Talmud in a way that is systematic. And there's a support because now there's a lot of people who do it at the same time. And there's a whole movement around starting it on the same day and finishing it on the same day. So it's a big undertaking.
Facebook groups for it.
Yeah.
But I just wanted to see what was in there, right?
Yeah,
in the same Watch, I'm going to do a thing for you now. In the same way that I think that it's so important that Washington went to Newport and met with the congregation so that he knew what he was talking about.
Yes.
Right? For me, it was very important to, you hear about Talmud, you have it quoted at you. I wanted to get my hands on it.
Yeah.
I wanted to meet it in person.
No, that's great.
Right?
It's really important. Yeah.
That was a pro right there to bring this full circle. I am thoroughly impressed.
I'm angling to get invited back, guys. That's what I'm after.
I think with that close, you might have just earned yourself another invite.
That's so funny. That is really funny.
So before we sign off, is there anything you want to promote or any place where people can look for your work or anything along those lines?
I'll promote a couple of projects that I'm involved in. So I mentioned in passing that I do teach for Tikva online and in their summer program. And if you are a Jewish parent who has high school students and even younger than high school, and you don't know about the Tikva Fund and about what they're doing with Jewish education, I urge you to look into that.
Good,
They are currently, I believe, or about to start accepting applications for the summer program, which is a 2-week-long summer program, combination of religious subjects and secular subjects. I'll be teaching a class on power and language while I'm there. We'll be reading a lot of Orwell, and it'll be a good time.
That's
but those are great weeks. Yeah. So you can also find things that I'm involved with at the libertyfund.org website and all of our sister websites, adamsmithworks.org, econlive.org. I'm sometimes over at Law and Liberty. I'm all over the place.
Wow. You're very impressive.
Awesome.
It was really a treat to talk to you. I mean, I could go on forever if I didn't have to go teach right now.
It's been a delight, guys.
I know.
When do you sleep?
I know.
Sleep is for the
but thanks. Well, thanks so much for the time, Sarah. This was a great conversation.
It was.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been a treat.
Thank you.
Awesome.
Thank you.
Take care, guys.